Have you ever heard of a man who not only dedicated his life to the poor, but transformed charity into a miracle that resonates to this day? Saint Vincent de Paul was not just a saint. He was a revolutionary of compassion. But what few know is that his journey to sainthood began with a surprising secret, a moment of slavery that nearly destroyed him. How did a slave become the greatest advocate for the poor and the founder of a work that would change the world forever? Stay with me and subscribe, because by the end of this video, you will discover how a single act of faith changed not only his life, but could also transform yours. It was the year 1581 in the small village of Puy, in Gascony, southern France. A remote place surrounded by fields of wheat and vineyards swaying in the wind like waves in a golden sea. There, Vincent was born, the third of 6 children in a family of poor peasants. The house where he lived was modest, built of wood and clay, with cracks that let the winter cold seep in mercilessly. There was no luxury, only the essentials, but even the essentials seemed scarce. The days began before the sun rose, with the dry sound of farming tools and the lowing of cows in the barn. Vincent, still small, already helped in the fields, guiding the plow or gathering firewood. Life was hard, and fatigue accumulated in the thin body of a boy who had yet to know another reality. The smell of wet earth and sweat filled the air, while his small, calloused hands gripped the tools of labor tightly. Despite the hardships, there was something that warmed Vincent's heart: his mother's living faith, a woman of unwavering courage who, even in the face of deprivation, always found time to teach her children the teachings of Christ. At night, when the shadows lengthened and the only light came from an oil lamp, she gathered the family around the table and, with a calm voice, recited passages from the Gospel. Vincent listened attentively, his eyes shining with curiosity and devotion. Faith was not just a comfort, it was a force that kept the family united. Vincent learned to pray before he even knew how to work. His prayers were simple, but filled with pure fervor. He prayed for better days, for health for his parents, and for his siblings. It was in this environment of struggle and spirituality that his soul began to be shaped, learning from an early age to find hope even amidst adversity. A significant moment in his childhood was the day Vincent heard Mass for the first time in his village church. The small temple was simple, with rustic wooden benches and stone walls. When the bell rang, announcing the start of the celebration, the sound echoed across the fields, calling the faithful. Vincent entered, shy, but was immediately captivated by the sacred atmosphere. The aroma of incense, the glow of candles, and the voices of the choir created an environment that seemed to transcend the earthly world. Upon seeing the priest at the altar, something awakened in his heart. He could not explain what he felt, but that figure, dressed in white, speaking with authority and kindness, ignited a flame that would never be extinguished. In that moment, Vincent felt a calling for the first time, even though he did not yet understand what it meant. However, the poverty of the family was a harsh reality that could not be ignored. Vincent was aware that his education depended on sacrifices. His father, despite being exhausted from working in the fields, decided to invest in his son's talent, recognizing his sharp intelligence. To do this, he sold the few oxen they owned, an act of renunciation that deeply marked Vincent. He never forgot the weary look in his father's eyes when making that decision, a look that silently said, "I am giving up everything for you." With the money obtained, Vincent was sent to school in Dax, a nearby town. It was his first experience away from home, and the longing for his family weighed like a stone in his heart. At night, alone in his simple room, he remembered the prayers around the table and his mother's encouraging smile. But the faith she had planted in him sustained him. At school, Vincent quickly stood out. His talent for studies caught the attention of his teachers, and he began to dream of something greater. He felt that God had plans for him, although he did not yet understand what they were. Each day was a mix of excitement and challenge, for even outside the fields, poverty accompanied him. Many times he felt cold due to inadequate clothing or hunger because food was scarce. Despite this, Vincent never complained. He believed that each difficulty was a necessary step in his journey. Gradually, the image of the priest he had seen in his childhood began to form as an ideal in his mind. He wanted to be like that man who seemed to bring the peace and light of Christ to everyone around him. The childhood of St. Vincent de Paul was fertile ground, where faith, resilience, and love for others began to blossom. It was as if God was shaping his soul from an early age, preparing him for a mission he could not yet imagine. Behind the difficulties, there was a silent preparation, a calling that echoed in every experience, molding the character of one who would become one of the greatest examples of charity and humility in history. During this period of his life, Vincent learned the lessons he would carry forever: the value of work, the importance of faith, and the transformative power of love for others. It was the beginning of an extraordinary journey that started in the fields of Gascony but would reach hearts all around the world. At the age of 15, Vincent de Paul already carried within him a desire that set him apart from many young people his age. Growing up in a family that was intimately familiar with deprivation and the burden of the land, he dreamed of something that seemed almost unattainable: the priesthood. The path to that dream, however, was not paved with ease. In the society where poverty was a hard sentence to break, the idea of a young peasant becoming a priest seemed as unlikely as a river flowing uphill. But Vincent, still so young, demonstrated unwavering faith and determination. It all began in his hometown, when a teacher noticed Vincent's sharp intelligence. He stood out among others, absorbing what was taught to him with unusual speed and demonstrating a natural ability for reading and writing, skills that were a luxury at a time when many could barely spell their own names. The teacher believed Vincent had the potential for something greater, and with the encouragement of some locals who became his first supporters, the young man decided to head to Dax, a nearby town, where he could continue his studies. This decision, however, came with a profound sacrifice. Vincent's father, despite already living in scarcity, sold the few oxen he owned, an act that represented the renunciation of a fundamental part of the family's sustenance. The dry sound of Vincent's footsteps as he left the house was accompanied by the silent gazes of his younger siblings, who could not hide their mix of pride and sadness. He knew that the weight of expectations now rested on his shoulders. He could not disappoint. In Dax, life was not easy. Vincent lived extremely simply, staying in a modest house provided by a local benefactor. The walls of his room were cold, the mattress a simple mound of straw, and the smell of dampness was constant. During the day, he dedicated himself tirelessly to his studies, learning Latin, philosophy, and theology. At night, he read by the light of a nearly burnt-out candle, his eyes burning with fatigue. The silence of the room was only interrupted by the sound of the wind passing through the window cracks and the echo of his prayers, always fervent, asking for strength to continue. Among his peers, Vincent was known for his humility and willingness to help. He often shared his meager food with those who had even less. Despite this, he faced challenges that tested his patience and faith. As a young man from humble origins, he was frequently the target of prejudice from some wealthier classmates. Hurtful comments and disdainful looks accompanied him, but Vincent, without losing his composure, responded with serene silence and sometimes a discreet smile. He knew that his strength came from something much greater than the opinion of those who looked down on him. During a particularly difficult period, Vincent nearly gave up. The costs of his studies were high, and he knew that his family's situation was becoming increasingly complicated. In a letter, written in firm handwriting but overflowing with emotion. He even asked his father for permission to abandon his studies and return to help in the fields. The response, which arrived weeks later, was simple yet impactful. "Do not return. Continue. We are praying for you." That letter was for Vincent like a rebirth of his determination. He decided that he would do whatever it took to honor his family's sacrifice. The effort was worth it. At 19, Vincent was ordained a priest, a remarkable achievement for someone so young. The day of his ordination was marked by a mix of emotions. On one side, there was joy and gratitude. On the other, the weight of a new responsibility. The ceremony took place in a simple church, but for Vincent, that moment held the grandeur of something divine. When the holy oil touched his hands, he felt a wave of warmth sweep through his body, as if it were confirmation that God was blessing his mission. After the ordination, Vincent celebrated his first Mass with a devotion that impressed those present. He spoke about humility, about the call to serve, and about the example of Christ, who lived to love and care for the most needy. Although the young priest did not yet know what the future held for him, he already demonstrated the essence that would make him an example of charity and faith. A heart willing to serve, regardless of the cost. But Vincent's story was just beginning. Although he had achieved the dream of becoming a priest, life would continue to present challenges that would shape his soul. The humility of his origins, the sacrifice of his family, and the unwavering faith he cultivated in his heart would be the pillars that supported him in the years to come. At 19, Vincent de Paul was not just a young priest. He was a living testament that God operates even in the most unlikely circumstances. The peasant boy who once worked under the burning sun of the fields now wore sacred vestments and held the chalice of sacrifice in his hands. What he did not yet know was that his vocation would take him far beyond the walls of the church. It was the year 1605 when the young priest, Vincent de Paul, embarked on a journey that was supposed to be just a brief mission for business and would unexpectedly change the course of his life drastically. The sky over the Mediterranean was a deep blue, reflecting on the calm waters, but that peace would only be a momentary illusion. As the ship carrying Vincent approached the shore, the unexpected happened. A group of Turkish pirates attacked with brutal violence. The sounds of screams echoed across the deck as sailors tried in vain to defend themselves. Swords sparkled in the sun, and the smell of gunpowder mixed with the salt of the sea. Vincent, unable to fight, was quickly captured, his hands bound with rough ropes that cut into his skin. He watched helplessly as other passengers were subdued, many of them injured or dead. Fear enveloped him like a heavy fog, but in his heart, he silently prayed for strength to face what would come next. The following days were a nightmare. Vincent was taken, along with other prisoners, to the city of Tunis in North Africa, a center of the slave trade. The market where he was displayed seemed like a scene of absolute despair. Men, women, and children were chained, their eyes filled with fear and resignation. The merchants' shouts announcing the prices mingled with the muffled cries of the captives. Vincent felt a deep humiliation when he was placed before the buyers, treated like a commodity. He was purchased by a fisherman who needed labor for his boats. In the days that followed, Vincent worked tirelessly under the scorching sun. The hands that once held the sacred chalice now pulled heavy nets full of fish as sweat trickled down his face. Each pull was a battle against fatigue and pain. The nights were cold, and he slept on the floor of an improvised hut, listening to the distant sound of the waves and feeling loneliness as an overwhelming presence. Still, amid the darkness, Vincent continued to pray, seeking in God the strength he could not find within himself. After months of exhausting work, Vincent was sold again, this time to an alchemist who conducted strange and dangerous experiments. This man, though stern and temperamental, allowed Vincent to learn some of his knowledge. Observing the experiments with metals and chemical substances, Vincent began to understand the power of patience and persistence. He also realized that, even in the most unlikely situations, there were lessons to be learned. During this time, he seized every opportunity to discreetly share his faith, hoping to plant seeds of hope in the hearts of other captives. The biggest turning point, however, occurred when Vincent was sold to a third master, a former Christian who had converted to Islam. This man, although strict, was married to a woman deeply curious about Christianity. Intrigued by Vincent's behavior, who never complained even under the worst circumstances, she began asking questions about his faith. Gradually, Vincent found the opportunity to share the teachings of Christ, not only with words, but with his attitude of humility, patience, and compassion. Over time, the woman convinced her husband to listen to Vincent. The young priest spoke about God's love and forgiveness with a sincerity that deeply touched those who heard him. Gradually, the man's heart began to change. In an unexpected twist, he decided to abandon Islam and return to Christianity, taking his wife and Vincent with him. This act of courage was a testament to the transformative power of faith and perseverance. Finally, in 1607, after 2 years of captivity, Vincent de Paul was freed. The journey back to France was marked by a mix of relief and reflection. As the ship sailed through the waters of the Mediterranean, Vincent looked at the horizon, thinking of all he had experienced. He knew he was no longer the same man who had departed. The suffering, humiliation, and difficulties had refined his character, strengthening his determination to dedicate his life to those in need. Upon arriving in France, Vincent made a silent vow. He would use everything he had learned to serve others, especially those who, like him, faced the deepest challenges of life. The experience of captivity was not just a chapter of pain in his story, but a lesson in compassion, resilience, and unwavering faith. The young priest, now marked by the experience, was ready to embrace the purpose that God had reserved for him. After his release from captivity, Vincent de Paul returned to France as a man transformed by the trials he had faced. Despite the apparent tranquility, he lived with a deep inner conflict. The young priest, now just over 20 years old, began to experience a silent struggle between the desire for a comfortable life and the irresistible call to serve the needy. It was as if his heart was being pulled in opposite directions. On one side, the temptation to seek security and prestige. On the other, the awareness of the suffering of others that he could no longer ignore. Vincent took a small job as a chaplain in a noble Parisian family, the Gondi. This new position seemed to provide relief after the hardships of captivity. He lived in a refined environment, surrounded by wealth and privilege. The aroma of sumptuous meals, the glow of golden candelabras, and the discreet whispers of servants in the hallways composed the backdrop of his routine. However, Vincent did not feel at peace. The abundance around him starkly contrasted with the images he carried in his memory: the mistreated prisoners in the galleys, the captives in the slave market, and the poor he encountered on the streets of Paris. During this period, Vincent began to regularly visit prisons and galleys. There, the horrors he witnessed deeply marked him. The screams of prisoners, the unbearable stench of filth and disease, and the chains cutting into their skin were a cruel reminder of human misery. The pain was almost palpable, as if it permeated the air around him. Vincent felt the weight of this reality on his soul, and each visit seemed to open a new wound in his heart. He began to question whether his life surrounded by comfort was compatible with his priestly calling. Once during one of these visits, he encountered a man on the verge of death, whose words changed his life forever. "Father," the man said with a trembling voice, "do not let others die like this, without hope and without faith." Those words echoed like a cry in his heart. Vincent knew he could not continue living only for himself. He needed to do something to alleviate the suffering of the most forgotten and bring them the light of faith. However, Vincent's transformation was not immediate. He still struggled with the desire to seek stability and security. There were moments when he wondered if it would be better to focus solely on his work as a chaplain, which provided him with a quiet and respectable life. Nevertheless, it seemed that God constantly challenged him to step out of his comfort zone. Every time Vincent thought about settling down, a new need or suffering crossed his path, as if it were a reminder that his mission was greater than himself. An important turning point occurred when Vincent had the opportunity to preach in a small village, responding to the request of the Gondi family. During the homily, he spoke passionately about Christ's love for the poor and the responsibility of Christians to care for one another. At the end of the Mass, a simple man approached him and, with tears in his eyes, confessed his sins and expressed his gratitude for finally finding peace. It was at that moment that Vincent realized the transformative impact he could have on people's lives by sharing the message of Christ. From then on, he decided to dedicate himself more fervently to preaching and serving the most needy. Shortly thereafter, Vincent began organizing regular visits to the poorest communities, bringing not only spiritual comfort, but also practical help. He gathered donations of food, clothing, and medicine, and worked tirelessly to ensure that no one was left behind. Each visit was a mix of pain and hope. The suffering he witnessed was almost unbearable, but the grateful smiles of those he helped renewed his strength and determination. Vincent's inner struggle did not disappear completely, but it was gradually overcome by the power of love for his neighbor. He discovered that true peace did not come from material comfort, but from the generous giving of oneself in service to others. This period of his life marked the beginning of his journey as one of the greatest examples of charity and humility in the history of the Church. Vincent de Paul had found a new sense of his vocation, and that sense was deeply rooted in compassion, faith, and the desire to do good, even in the most challenging circumstances. Vincent de Paul's life took another unexpected turn when he met Madame Marguerite de Gondi, a woman of deep faith and a generous heart. The wife of an influential nobleman, Philippe Emmanuel de Gondi, she represented everything Vincent had previously avoided: wealth, status, and power. However, their meeting was not just a coincidence, but a turning point that would give new meaning to the saint's life and initiate a charitable work that would change the world. Madame de Gondi was a woman with a penetrating gaze and a firm voice, but there was a restlessness within her that Vincent quickly noticed. Despite living surrounded by luxury, she felt a spiritual emptiness and sought someone who could help her understand how to use her privileged position to serve God. Initially hesitant, Vincent accepted the position of chaplain to the family. He believed he could continue his mission in silence without getting too involved with the aristocratic circle. But he was about to discover that God had other plans. In the early months, Vincent noticed that the fields and villages under the Gondis' responsibility were plunged into an abyss of poverty. During his pastoral visits, he witnessed scenes of despair that haunted him. The peasants lived in miserable huts, surrounded by malnourished and sick children. The smell of disease and lack of food filled the air. Many died without the sacraments, as priests rarely visited these forgotten regions. Vincent could not ignore the suffering he saw, but he also knew he could not change this reality alone. Madame de Gondi was deeply moved when she heard Vincent's accounts. One afternoon, while walking through the vast gardens of the estate, she confided in him her anguish. "Father Vincent, how can I live surrounded by so much luxury, knowing that there are so many souls suffering from our indifference?" That moment was decisive. Vincent, with the sincerity characteristic of him, replied, "Madame, God gives us the means to act, but it is up to us to use them with courage and love. Shortly thereafter, Vincent was called to assist a man on the verge of death in one of the nearby villages. The peasant, a weary-looking worker with calloused hands, confessed that he did not know he should seek absolution for his sins. His spiritual ignorance shocked Vincent. Throughout the journey back to the Gondi home, he reflected on how many lived and died without access to the sacraments. Indignation and compassion grew in his heart, but it was Madame de Gondi who encouraged him to act. She proposed that Vincent preach regular missions in the villages of the region to teach catechism, hear confessions, and bring comfort to the poor. With resources provided by her and her husband, Vincent began organizing these missions. He traveled from village to village, facing muddy roads, storms, and long journeys. The masses were held in barns or outdoors, with peasants gathering around Vincent to hear his words. He spoke with simplicity, but with a fervor that captivated even the hardest hearts. During one of these missions, a significant event occurred. A young man who had lived as a thief and fugitive approached Vincent after hearing his preaching on forgiveness. "Father," he said with a choked voice, "do you believe that God can forgive me even after everything I have done?" Vincent looked into his eyes and replied, "God never tires of forgiving. It is you who needs to trust in him." That moment of reconciliation was one of many that strengthened Vincent's determination to continue his mission. However, resistance soon appeared. Some nobles questioned why Vincent dedicated so much time to the peasants instead of focusing on his duties as a chaplain. There were also priests who criticized his sermons, saying he was overstepping his boundaries. Vincent, however, remained steadfast. He knew that the voice of the gospel needed to reach the forgotten, even if it meant facing criticism and obstacles. Madame de Gondi's support was essential during this period. She not only financed the missions, but also used her influence to ensure that Vincent had the freedom to act. Together, they began to dream of something greater, an organization that could provide continuous and structured help to the poorest. This idea would plant the seeds for the emergence of great charitable works in the years to come. The meeting with Madame de Gondi not only transformed Vincent's life, but also changed the course of his vocation. He realized that his mission was not just to save souls, but also to alleviate the physical suffering of those who were forgotten by society. This partnership of faith and charity marked the beginning of a movement that would transcend borders, proving that, with determination and love, it was possible to transform seemingly impossible realities. Vincent was no longer just a priest. He was becoming a leader, an unwavering servant, and an inspiration to all who sought to live the gospel in its fullness. And this was just the beginning. It was the year 1617, and Vincent de Paul had understood that his vocation went beyond the walls of the church. He had already witnessed the hunger that gnawed at bodies, the ignorance that clouded souls, and the abandonment that left entire communities at the mercy of fate. But it was in a small village in the French countryside that Vincent found the answer to the dilemma that had shaped his life until then: how to effectively reach the poor, bringing not only material relief, but also the light of the gospel. The opportunity arose unexpectedly during one of his evangelization missions. Vincent was called to attend to a gravely ill peasant. Upon entering the simple home, he was greeted by a suffocating smell of mold and despair. The man, lying on an improvised bed of straw, was left to his own devices. The wife, with tears in her eyes, confessed that she didn't know how to help and that the priest was her last hope. Vincent listened to the man patiently, heard his confession, and administered the last sacraments. But as he left that house, something weighed heavily on his soul. How many others like him were dying this way? Vincent asked himself as he walked along the dirt roads. He knew that despite all his dedication, he could not reach everyone on his own. It was then that a simple yet revolutionary idea emerged in his mind. What if he could organize people to help one another? What if charity were a collective endeavor, fueled by love for one's neighbor? Upon returning to the Gondi family home, Vincent shared his idea with Madame de Gondi. She, deeply moved by the plight of the poor living on her lands, supported the initiative without hesitation. If God has placed riches in our hands, it is so that we may use them in His service, she said with conviction. With the resources of the Gondi family and Vincent's spiritual leadership, the first confraternity of charity began to take shape. Vincent started by visiting the most pious and influential women in the community, inviting them to participate in this new project. He spoke with a fervor that was impossible to ignore. Christ calls us to wash the feet of the poor as if they were the feet of our own Lord, he said, his eyes burning with passion. The women, many of whom were used to a life of comfort, were initially hesitant. The idea of leaving their homes to care for the poorest seemed uncomfortable and, for some, even impractical. But Vincent knew how to touch their hearts. He spoke not only of duty, but of privilege, of how serving the poor was a way to be closer to God. The first meeting of the confraternity was a milestone. Gathered in a small room lit only by candlelight, the women listened to Vincent speak with intensity. He did not use difficult words or lengthy speeches. His words were simple but laden with emotion. He described the conditions in which the poor lived, the sick who died alone, and the mothers weeping for not having anything to give their children. Some women began to cry as they listened to him. Vincent concluded by saying, "We cannot do everything, but we can start. One soul saved is already an eternal triumph." Thus was born the first confraternity of charity, composed of women who committed to visiting the poor, caring for the sick, and ensuring that no one was overlooked in their community. Each woman had a specific role. Some collected food and clothing, others visited the sick, and others dedicated themselves to teaching catechism to the children. Vincent, as a skilled organizer, oversaw every detail, ensuring that the work remained true to its purpose of serving with humility and love. The impact was immediate. Families who had previously lived in misery began to realize they were no longer alone. Children, once pale and lifeless, began to smile again as they received care and attention. The sick, who had once awaited death in solitude, now received regular visits, prayers, and, when possible, basic treatments. The sound of prayers and hymns began to fill the previously silent and hopeless homes. However, challenges soon arose. Some women from the confraternity began to complain about the exhausting work and the difficult conditions they faced during visits. One of them, visibly irritated, said to Vincent, "Father, this is too much for us. We were not made for this." Vincent, with his unwavering patience, replied, "What we do for the poor is not an obligation, it is an act of love. And love, my daughter, never weighs us down." His words deeply touched the woman, who later confessed that she felt ashamed for having thought of giving up. Little by little, the confraternity of charity began to expand to other communities. Vincent traveled tirelessly, facing long journeys on dangerous roads to train new volunteers and inspire other priests to follow his example. He knew that the mission was greater than himself, and that only with the involvement of many could they reach the most forgotten. The success of the confraternity was not only measured by the number of people served, but by the transformation it brought to the hearts of those who served. Women who had once lived in a closed world, concerned only with their own families, now found purpose and joy in serving. One of them confided in Vincent, "I thought I was helping the poor, but I realized they are the ones saving my soul." At the end of each day, Vincent thanked God for what had been accomplished, but he also asked for strength to continue. He knew there was still much to be done. The confraternity of charity was only the beginning of a work that he never imagined would become an eternal legacy. But at that moment, as he saw the fruits of their labor blossoming, he was certain he was on the right path, the path of love in action. The year was 1625. Vincent de Paul, now with a solid experience in caring for the poor, felt that something was still missing. Although the confraternities of charity were flourishing and bringing relief to needy communities, he perceived that the spiritual hunger of the peasants continued to grow. The priests in rural parishes were often unprepared or unmotivated, and the most remote populations remained outside the church's pastoral reach. Vincent knew that his mission needed to go further. It was necessary to train a new generation of committed priests who would bring faith and dignity to those forgotten by society. It was in a small meeting, surrounded by simplicity, that Vincent shared his vision with a group of priests who shared his desire to evangelize the poor. The location was a modest stone hall, lit by candles that cast flickering shadows on the walls, as if the light was struggling against the darkness of the world. Vincent, with a calm but firm tone, explained, "Those who live in the countryside do not only suffer from hunger for bread, but from hunger for faith. They thirst to know God, and it is our duty to bring them this living water." Vincent's heart burned with passion for this cause. He did not see the peasants merely as material poor, but as precious souls, abandoned by the indifference of a society focused on cities and courts. He knew that reaching these people would require more than good intentions. It was necessary to have an army of prepared, dedicated men willing to face the challenges that would come. The tension of that moment was palpable. Those who listened to Vincent understood the weight of what he was proposing. It would not be an easy mission. The roads were dangerous, infested with bandits. Rural communities often distrusted outsiders, and living conditions were brutal. Vincent, however, was determined. If Christ came into the world to serve and not to be served, how could we, his servants, do any less? This question echoed like an inescapable challenge, calling each man present to a decision. With the support of Madame de Gondi, who once again positioned herself as a faithful ally, Vincent founded the Congregation of the Mission, also known as the Lazarists. The objective was clear: to train priests dedicated to preaching, education, and spiritual assistance to the peasants. The chosen motto was simple but powerful: Evangelizare pauperibus, to evangelize the poor. From that moment on, Vincent's life and that of his companions would be marked by relentless journeys, carrying the message of the gospel to the farthest corners of France. The first missions of the Lazarists were filled with challenges. The priests traveled in small groups, often on foot or on mules, carrying only the essentials. The roads were long, muddy on rainy days, and dusty on scorching sunny days. Vincent, even as he grew older, insisted on leading by example. He was the first to rise in the morning and the last to rest at night, always encouraging his companions with words and prayers. On one of these journeys, the group arrived at a particularly isolated village. The houses, made of weathered wood and straw, seemed abandoned at first glance. When the priests began to explore the area, they noticed that the inhabitants were hiding in their homes, fearing they were tax collectors or soldiers. Vincent, with his usual patience and compassion, went door to door, speaking to families, showing them that they had nothing to fear. He said, "We have come not to take anything from you, but to bring you what is rightfully yours, the word of God." The villagers gradually began to come out of their homes, still wary but curious. Vincent celebrated an outdoor mass in a field where the sound of the wind and the singing of birds mingled with prayers. He preached with a simplicity that deeply touched the hearts of those who listened. It spoke of a God who had not forgotten them, of a love that made no distinction between rich and poor. Many wept upon hearing those words, feeling for the first time that they were important in God's eyes. The work of the Congregation of the Mission was not limited to preaching alone. Vincent believed it was necessary to care for the material needs of the communities so that the spiritual message could be fully embraced. The priests helped organize food distribution, built makeshift schools to educate children, and offered counseling to families. In a time of great inequality, these simple yet transformative gestures ignited hope in hearts hardened by misery. Vincent's journey, however, was not without difficulties. Some members of the clergy criticized his work, accusing him of overly popularizing the faith or straying from traditions. Others questioned whether so much effort for the poor was truly worthwhile. Vincent faced these criticisms with serenity, responding that it is not the greatness of our works that matters, but the love with which we perform them. The congregation of the mission continued to grow, attracting new members who shared Vincent's ideal. Each new priest was trained with the care of a gardener, nurturing a precious plant. Vincent insisted not only on theological education, but also on spiritual and human formation. He knew that to face the trials of the field, the priests needed more than knowledge. They needed a firm heart, rooted in love for God and neighbor. The impact of the congregation of the mission was profound. Entire villages that had once lived in spiritual darkness began to flourish. Faith, once forgotten, became the center of community life again. Vincent, seeing the fruits of his labor, sought neither recognition nor praise. For him, each soul rescued was a silent yet eternal victory. The founding of the Congregation of the Mission marked a new chapter in the life of St. Vincent de Paul. He had found a way to expand his mission, multiplying his efforts through other dedicated priests. It was the beginning of a work that would transcend the limits of his own life, perpetuating the legacy of love, faith, and service he had built with such dedication. The field was being sown, and the fruits that would arise from it would forever change the history of the Church and the world. In the year 1633, Vincent de Paul faced a new challenge in his mission to transform lives. Although the congregation of the mission was flourishing and the Lazarists were evangelizing the most remote communities, Vincent sensed that something crucial was still missing. Assistance for the poor and the sick, especially in the cities, needed dedicated, compassionate, and present hands. He knew that the priests were limited in their ability to care directly for the needy, and that it was necessary to mobilize other forces to confront such great need. It was at this moment that an extraordinary figure entered the story, Louise de Marillac. A widow, deeply religious, and with a heart full of compassion, Louise found in Vincent not only a spiritual guide, but also a friend and mentor who would help channel her immense devotion into a practical and transformative mission. Vincent, in turn, recognized in Louise the strength that was lacking to expand his charitable work. Louise was a woman with a penetrating gaze, marked by both pain and determination. Despite her physical frailties, she possessed an unbreakable inner energy. Vincent and Louise began to work together, visiting hospitals, orphanages, and the streets of Paris, where the poor lived in indescribable conditions. The misery on the streets was suffocating. Vincent and Louise witnessed daily abandoned children, starving women, and sick people dying without any assistance. The stench of illness was almost unbearable, and the moans of those suffering echoed through the narrow alleys of the city. During one of these visits, a mother, about to lose her small child to hunger, grasped Vincent's hands in desperation. Her eyes, swollen from crying, were a silent plea for help. Deeply moved, Vincent gave her what little he had with him, but realized that individual gestures were not enough. He knew he needed a more structured solution to meet the growing demands. It was then that the idea of the Daughters of Charity was born, a revolutionary community for the time. Unlike traditional religious orders, the Daughters of Charity would not live sequestered in convents, but would be consecrated women serving directly in the streets, hospitals, and homes of the most needy. Vincent, with his innate ability to inspire and organize, began to recruit young women willing to dedicate their lives to serving the poor. The beginning of this work was humble but deeply significant. In a small room illuminated by a window letting in the soft morning light, Vincent and Louise gathered the first volunteers. He spoke with words that carried both authority and tenderness, telling them they were called to be the arms of Christ and that they should serve not only with their hands, but with their hearts. It was not enough to feed the body. It was necessary to nourish the soul. The young women, many of them from humble backgrounds, listened attentively, aware of the magnitude of the commitment they were making. Vincent, always attentive to detail, began teaching them the basics of caring for the sick, from how to clean wounds to the importance of listening patiently to those on the brink of death. He insisted that service was not just a task, but an expression of love for God. The first great test came soon after the founding of the Daughters of Charity. A devastating epidemic swept through Paris, leaving a trail of death and despair. While many fled the city, Vincent, Louisa, and the young women of the new community stayed behind. Dressed in simple garments, the Daughters of Charity went from house to house, facing the risk of contamination to bring medicine, food, and spiritual comfort. The sounds of prayers, combined with the groans of the sick, became part of daily life. On one of those difficult days, Louisa found an orphaned child huddled in a corner of an abandoned house. The girl, skinny and covered in dirt, did not say a word, but her eyes expressed deep fear. Louisa, with the tenderness of a mother, held the child in her arms and began to sing a soft song, calming her. When Vincent arrived at the scene, he saw Louisa holding the girl with tears in her eyes. Louisa said, "She needs more than food, Father. She needs love." This episode was a turning point for the Daughters of Charity, as it showed that their mission went beyond meeting material needs. They were called to be the living presence of Christ's love among the most abandoned. Over time, the work of the Daughters of Charity began to be recognized for its effectiveness and dedication. Hospitals, orphanages, and schools came to rely on their constant presence. In each place, they brought not only practical assistance, but also hope and dignity. Vincent, always humble, would say that it was all God's work, but he knew that the combined efforts of him and Louisa had planted seeds that would continue to bear fruit. However, resistance did not take long to emerge. Some people from high society criticized the fact that young women were going out into the streets to care for the poor. Some more conservative priests accused Vincent of going against tradition by allowing consecrated women to live outside convents. Vincent faced these criticisms with serenity, explaining that love could not be confined within walls. "Christ walked among the poor," he said, "and that is where we must be." The founding of the Daughters of Charity was one of the most significant moments in Vincent de Paul's life. This work not only revolutionized the way charity was seen, but also created a new path for women who wished to serve God and others. Each Daughter of Charity became a reflection of Vincent's vision: hands that heal, hearts that love, and lives dedicated to transforming the world. This legacy, initiated with humility and courage, remains alive today, reminding everyone that true service lies in the meeting of faith and action. For Vincent, the Daughters of Charity were proof that when love is put into practice, it has the power to change not only individuals, but also history. In 17th century France, few men carried the admiration and trust of so many spheres of society as Vincent de Paul. Although he had dedicated his life to the poor and marginalized, his wisdom, humility, and sense of justice led him to an unexpected role: that of spiritual and political advisor to some of the most powerful nobles and monarchs of the time. This phase of Vincent's life, marked by contrast between the luxury of the courts and the poverty of the streets, revealed even more his deep commitment to the mission of serving God above all. Around 1643, Vincent's reputation as a trustworthy and discerning priest reached the ears of Queen Anne of Austria, regent of France and mother of the young King Louis XIV. France was going through a tumultuous time. Internal wars, famine, and political instability plagued the country, creating an ever-widening chasm between the aristocracy and the people. The Queen, aware of the need for spiritual guidance in such difficult times, summoned Vincent to the palace to become part of her personal council. The call to the court was a dilemma for Vincent. He feared that proximity to power could distract him from his original mission. How could he reconcile the simplicity of his vocation with the opulent protocols and political complexity of the palace? However, Vincent also knew that this opportunity could be used to benefit the poor and promote the reforms that the church so desperately needed. With prayer and humility, he accepted the invitation, but with a non-negotiable condition: he would continue to be a servant of the poor, never compromising his values. Upon arriving at the palace, Vincent was received with a mix of curiosity and respect. He was not impressed by the lavish halls adorned with fine tapestries, golden chandeliers, and the sparkle of the jewels that adorned the nobles. His gaze was fixed on another objective: to be a voice of truth and compassion in an environment often marked by intrigue and vanity. During meetings with the Queen, Vincent maintained his calm and direct tone. He advised wisely, often challenging decisions he considered unjust or harmful to the people. An emblematic episode occurred when the Queen proposed raising taxes on rural communities to finance military campaigns. Vincent, in a gesture of courage, intervened. "Your Majesty, the peasants are already eating roots to survive. If we take even more from them, we will be condemning them to death." His words, laden with truth and compassion, caused the Queen to reconsider her decision. This moment revealed Vincent's power. It was not his position at court that made him influential, but his integrity and the respect he had earned. Despite his closeness to the throne, Vincent never distanced himself from the poor. He continued to visit the streets of Paris, hospitals, and remote villages. Often, he would leave the palace in the early hours of the morning, with his feet firmly planted on the muddy streets, bringing spiritual and material comfort to those in need. The contrast between the luxury of the court and the misery he encountered further reinforced his commitment to being a bridge between these two distant worlds. Vincent also used his position to influence the reform of the clergy. He realized that many priests were not adequately prepared for their spiritual responsibilities, which resulted in pastoral neglect and scandals. As a royal advisor, he advocated for the establishment of seminaries and training programs that would ensure that future priests were men of virtue and knowledge. His dedication to this cause yielded lasting fruits, marking a turning point in the history of the Church in France. Another significant moment occurred when Vincent interceded on behalf of the galley prisoners. These men, often forgotten by society, lived in inhumane conditions, chained and treated with extreme cruelty. Using his influence, Vincent was able to raise awareness among the nobles and the Queen herself, obtaining resources to improve the living conditions of these prisoners and to provide them with spiritual assistance. He personally visited the galleys, listening to confessions and offering hope to those whom society had discarded. However, not everyone viewed Vincent's influence favorably. Some members of the court, driven by jealousy or fear of losing power, attempted to slander him. He was accused of being excessively condescending to the poor and of using his position to promote a personal agenda. Vincent faced these criticisms with serenity, never responding with aggression. He would say to his collaborators, "Let us be steadfast in good, and God will take care of the rest," demonstrating his unwavering confidence in divine justice. Over the years, Vincent's presence at court continued to be a source of light amid the shadows of politics. He never allowed prestige or power to divert him from his original vocation. When the young Louis XIV ascended to the throne, Vincent made a point of reminding him of the responsibility that came with the crown. "Your Majesty, a king is not greater because of his riches or lands, but by the good he does for his people." Vincent's relationship with the powerful of his time was undoubtedly one of the most fascinating aspects of his life. He gracefully and firmly navigated between two seemingly incompatible worlds, using his position to bring hope to the forgotten and promote concrete changes. For Vincent, being at court was not a privilege, but an opportunity to serve a greater cause, caring for the poor and reforming the church. And even surrounded by kings and nobles, he remained, above all, a humble servant, faithful to his mission and to the God who guided every step of his journey. It was the year 1660. Vincent de Paul had already passed the age of 80, a remarkable feat in a time when few reached such longevity. His body was weakened by decades of tireless work. The long journeys, the rigorous fasts, the physical effort in missions, and the cold of nights in forgotten villages had left their marks. His hands, once firm in holding the chalice, now trembled, but his spirit remained as strong as it had always been. He knew that his time on earth was coming to an end, but he was determined to spend every last breath serving the poor and the church he loved so dearly. Even in his frail state, Vincent continued to attend to those who came to him seeking counsel or help. His small room in the Lazarist house in Paris was constantly visited by people from all walks of life, from humble peasants to court nobles. The room was simple, with a wooden bed, a cross hanging on the wall, and a worn-out chair. The environment reflected his life, devoid of luxuries, but full of meaning. Vincent, often seated by the window, took advantage of the natural light to write letters as his vision was weakening. He never complained of pain or fatigue. Instead, he repeated, "We cannot stop while there are souls to be saved." The last weeks of his life were marked by deeply emotional encounters. One such moment occurred when a group of daughters of charity came to visit him to thank him for his guidance and inspiration. The young women, who had dedicated their lives to serving the poor, knelt before Vincent with tears in their eyes. One of them, holding his trembling hands, said, "Father Vincent, what will become of us without you?" He, with his weakened voice but filled with tenderness, replied, "My daughters, the work is not mine, it is God's. He will continue to guide you, as he always has." That night, Vincent asked one of his priests to help him celebrate Mass in his room. He no longer had the strength to stand at the altar, but insisted on participating in the Eucharistic sacrifice. As he raised the chalice, his hands trembled, but his eyes were fixed on the mystery he was celebrating. It was a moment of profound communion between him and God, a prelude to his imminent departure. In the following days, Vincent began to quietly say goodbye to his community. He offered practical advice, like a father guiding his children before leaving them. To the Lazarists, he reminded them of the importance of remaining faithful to their mission of evangelizing the poor and forming priests. To the daughters of charity, he urged them never to lose the spirit of humility and dedication that made them so special. And to all who surrounded him, he left a message of hope. Do not be afraid of difficulties. Charity is a path that requires sacrifice, but it is the path that leads us to God. In the early morning of September 27, 1660, Vincent de Paul took his last breath. He lay in his bed surrounded by his Lazarist brothers, who were praying the 23rd Psalm, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." His face, even in death, seemed to radiate peace. It was as if, upon leaving this world, he was finally finding the rest that his weary body had long deserved. The news of Vincent's death spread quickly through Paris and beyond. Peasants, orphans, the sick and prisoners wept at his departure as if they had lost a father. Nobles and clergy, who had often been challenged by his courage and conviction, also mourned, acknowledging that the world had lost a man of unwavering faith and tireless heart. During his wake, a long line of people formed to pay their last respects. Men and women from all social classes gathered, united by love and respect for one who never made distinctions among them. The legacy of Vincent de Paul did not end with his death. The seeds he had planted continued to bloom. The confraternities of charity, the congregation of the mission, and the daughters of charity grew, spreading throughout France and eventually the world. Each charitable work, each heart touched by his mission, was a living testament that Christian love, when put into action, has the power to transform lives and entire societies. Even in the years that followed, Vincent continued to be remembered not only for his great achievements, but for his humanity. He was a man who, despite his influence and impact, never lost the simplicity and humility that defined him. For the poor, he was a brother. For the nobles, he was a conscience. And for all, he was an example of what it means to live the gospel fully. In 1737, Vincent de Paul was canonized by the Catholic Church, recognized as a saint for his extraordinary life of service and holiness. Today, his name is engraved not only in history, but in the hearts of millions who find inspiration in his life. Thus, even centuries after his death, Vincent continues to be a beacon of hope, reminding us that in serving others, we find the true path to God. To conclude, we invite you to subscribe to the Sacred Voices channel and be part of our community. If this story of St. Vincent de Paul touched your heart, leave a comment with your thoughts. Share the video with friends and family, and don't forget to like it, so we can keep bringing you inspiring stories. We also want to know which saints you would like to see in upcoming videos. Your participation is very important to us and helps spread these messages of faith and hope.